July 14, 1944. The hedgerow country south of Saint-Lô, France. Sergeant Eugene Luciano pressed his eye against the periscope of his M4 Sherman, scanning the bocage ahead through morning fog that clung to the ancient Norman hedgerows like smoke. His crew had been warned. Panthers ahead. The German medium tank wasn't medium at all, but a 45-ton Predator whose sloped frontal armour had proven nearly impervious to everything the Americans could throw at it. What Luciano didn't know, what none of the American tank crews crawling through Normandy's killing fields understood yet, was that tucked into their ammunition racks were 6 rounds that would fundamentally alter the psychological balance of armoured warfare. 6 M93 high-velocity armour-piercing rounds, each containing a tungsten carbide-core, capable of transforming their outgunned Sherman into something German Panther crews had been assured was impossible, a genuine threat. The morning Luciano's gunner acquired a Panther in his sights at 800 meters and fired one of those specialized rounds, watching it punch through the curved gun mantlet that German crews believed made them invincible. The tactical calculus of the Western Front began to shift. Not because American tanks had suddenly become superior to German designs. They hadn't, but because the myth of Panther invulnerability, the psychological foundation that sustained German armoured operations despite overwhelming Allied material superiority, had been shattered by American metallurgy and industrial capacity, working in concert to solve an urgent battlefield problem. The story of how a specialized ammunition type altered the balance of armored warfare begins not on the battlefields of Normandy, but in the testing grounds and industrial facilities of the United States, where metallurgists and ballistic engineers worked against time to solve a problem that threatened to undermine the entire American armored thrust into time, occupied Europe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In early 1944, the United States Army faced a crisis that military planners had catastrophically failed to anticipate. The M4 Sherman tank, the backbone of American armored divisions, the vehicle upon which the liberation of Europe depended, was encountering German tanks it could not reliably defeat from the front. Not occasionally, not in isolated instances, but systematically, across every engagement where American armour met German Panthers in open combat. The Panther, Germany's response to the Soviet T-34, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with 80mm of frontal glacis plate sloped at 55 degrees. This wasn't simply thick armour. The slope created an effective thickness of approximately 140mm, a barrier that proved nearly impenetrable to standard American tank guns at any practical combat range. American intelligence had failed completely. Planners had predicted that Panthers would appear in limited numbers, perhaps a company here, a platoon there, rare encounters that specialized tank destroyers could handle. By June 1944, when Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy, the reality was staggering. 38% of German tanks in the theatre were Panthers, not dozens. Hundreds of these advanced medium tanks, often crewed by inexperienced soldiers, rushed through abbreviated training, but protected by armour geometry that conventional American tank guns simply could not penetrate frontally. The 75mm M3 gun that armed most Shermans landing in Normandy could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at any range. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The armour-piercing round would strike the sloped glacis plate and ricochet skyward, leaving the Sherman crew exposed and vulnerable to return fire from the Panther's powerful gun, which could destroy a Sherman from over 2,000 meters away. The German crews didn't need to be veterans. They simply needed to keep their front armour toward the enemy and fire. Even the improved 76mm M1 gun, which began reaching forward units in July 1944, struggled against Panther armour in ways that shocked American commanders. Using standard M62 armour-piercing capped rounds, the 76mm could penetrate 109mm of armour at 1,000 meters at 0 degrees obliquity. This proved sufficient against the Panzer IV and many German assault guns. Against the Panther's sloped frontal armour, it was inadequate. The 76mm could penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, the curved piece of cast steel that protected the gun breech, but only at extremely close range, typically under 100 meters, a distance at which the Panther's advantages in firepower and armor made engagement suicidal for Sherman crews who understood the mathematics of their situation. The problem wasn't the gun itself. American ordnance engineers had designed a capable weapon. The problem was the ammunition it fired. Standard armor-piercing rounds relied on hardened steel penetrators driven by propellant charges. Against vertical armor, they performed adequately. Against the Panther's sophisticated slope geometry, they failed consistently. The deployment of the 76mm gun itself had been a saga of bureaucratic hesitation and catastrophically belated recognition of battlefield realities. The first M4 Shermans, mounting the 76mm M1 gun, rolled off production lines in January 1944. These M4 A176 Shermans arrived in Britain on April 10, 1944, with 130 tanks delivered specifically to prepare for the Normandy invasion that would determine the fate of occupied Europe. Yet, despite their availability, despite having these improved tanks sitting in British depots, American commanders refused to deploy them on D-Day. The reasons were multiple and, in retrospect, tragically short-sighted. Crews lacked adequate training time on the new weapon system. Logistical concerns about maintaining two different ammunition types in the supply chain complicated planning. Most critically, commanders believed the 75mm gun would prove adequate for the expected opposition based on intelligence assessments that would prove catastrophically wrong. This miscalculation cost American lives measured not in dozens but in hundreds. By early July 1944, field reports from Normandy painted a grim picture that could no longer be ignored or minimized. Sherman crews were being destroyed in engagements where German Panthers could fire from ranges that made American return fire ineffective. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe and immediate. On July 2nd, formal complaints about the 75mm gun's ineffectiveness against German armor reached General Dwight Eisenhower himself. His response, documented in multiple historical accounts and witnessed by staff officers, captured command-level frustration that had been building for weeks. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." The full quote, as recorded by witnesses, continued with considerably stronger language expressing his anger that ordnance specialists had assured him the 76mm would handle anything the Germans fielded. The assurances had proven empty. American tank crews were paying the price. A board convened on July 12, 1944, determined officially what tank crews already knew from bitter, often fatal experience. Standard American weapons could not defeat Panthers frontally. The technical data was unambiguous. The tactical implications were devastating. American armor doctrine relied on mobility and combined arms coordination. But these advantages meant nothing when German tanks could destroy Shermans from ranges where return fire was impossible. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered 76mm Shermans rushed from Britain to the front lines. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, 102 M4A 176 tanks made their combat debut in Normandy's hedgerow country. The initial engagement reports were sobering in their honesty. While the 76mm represented a genuine improvement over the 75mm, it still struggled against Panther frontal armor at practical combat ranges. Sherman crews quickly learned through experience that often proved fatal for those who learned slowly that they needed to maneuver for flank shots or target the Panther's gun mantlet at close range. Neither option was tactically desirable when facing a tank that could destroy them from 2,000 meters away while they maneuvered for position. The solution lay in metallurgy and physics, not in desperate tactics. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers working in facilities across the United States had developed the T4 round, later standardized as the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition that represented a fundamental departure from conventional armor-piercing design philosophy. The projectile consisted of a tungsten carbide core, one of the hardest materials available to industrial metallurgy, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield. This design concentrated the projectile's kinetic energy into a smaller, denser penetrator, while reducing overall projectile weight. The result was dramatic in ways that would transform American tank tactics. The M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second compared to 792 meters per second for the standard M62 round. This 244 meters per second velocity increase translated directly into penetrating power through the physics of kinetic energy. At 1,000 yards, approximately 914 meters, the HVAP round could penetrate 160 millimeters of armor at 10 degrees obliquity, according to official War Department testing data. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, with its curved 100 millimeter thick cast steel on early Ausf D and A variants, later increased to 120 millimeters on the Ausf G, this meant reliable penetration at ranges up to 1,000 meters, instead of point-blank distance. The mantlet suddenly became a viable target for Sherman crews who had previously been forced to attempt desperate flank attacks or retreat under fire. But the development of HVAP represented only half the solution to American armor problems. Production was another matter entirely, complicated by global resource constraints that would limit HVAP availability throughout the war. The T4 round depended on tungsten carbide, a strategic material imported primarily from China, which produced 36% of global tungsten supply before the war disrupted international trade networks. Tungsten was critical to numerous war industries competing for desperately limited supplies. Machine tools required tungsten carbide cutting edges. Armor-piercing ammunition for multiple calibers consumed vast quantities. Armor plate hardening processes needed tungsten additions. Various industrial processes, from electrical contacts to high-temperature applications, all competed for the same limited material. American tungsten demand for HVAP ammunition alone consumed hundreds of metric tons annually. Each 76mm HVAP round contained approximately 0.8 kilograms of tungsten carbide, meaning a Sherman carrying 6 rounds required nearly 5 kilograms of this scarce strategic material. Multiply that across thousands of tanks, and the scale of the supply challenge becomes clear. China produced approximately 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but this had to serve all Allied needs across all applications in every theater of a global war. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained severely constrained throughout the war. Germany's tungsten position was far worse, a strategic vulnerability that would increasingly cripple their ammunition development. Swedish imports, which had sustained German tungsten supplies in the early war years, declined sharply as the military situation turned against the Reich, and neutral Sweden increasingly tilted toward the Allies. German domestic tungsten production remained minimal throughout the war, despite desperate efforts to increase output. By 1945, German factories desperately hoarded tungsten for machine tools needed for aircraft engine production, the last hope for maintaining fighter production against overwhelming Allied bombing campaigns. Panther crews received only standard ammunition, while American Shermans, at least some of them, carried HVAP rounds that partially negated their armor advantage. The United States Ordnance Department had been testing HVAP projectiles since spring 1942, recognizing early that tungsten cores offered superior penetration. But production at the scale needed for frontline distribution did not begin until after the Normandy landings revealed the catastrophic extent of the Panther problem that intelligence had failed to predict. In July 1944, production of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 rounds. August saw 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP produced, barely enough to equip a fraction of the tanks that needed them. September yielded another 1,000 rounds. The production ramp was agonizingly slow given the urgent tactical need. Not until November 1944 did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds for the 76mm gun, ramping to 7,000 rounds per month by January 1945. By March 1945, Approximately 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition had been produced, representing a significant industrial effort involving multiple contractors and thousands of workers, but still a fraction of what frontline units desperately needed. By February 1945, after months of combat and production efforts, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds to face an enemy deploying Panthers as the standard medium tank in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total, while facing German units that might field 30 or more Panthers in sustained engagements. The mathematics were brutal. Commanders had to make impossible decisions about when to use their scarce HVAP ammunition, knowing that once exhausted, resupply was uncertain. The first HVAP rounds reached the European theatre in August 1944, but their arrival was overshadowed by broader tactical problems that made ammunition type almost secondary to survival. The Normandy hedgerows, those ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation that divided Norman farmland into small enclosed fields, had forced American armour into close-quarters combat, where superior German guns could ambush Sherman columns advancing through narrow gaps. Tank crews faced an enemy who had learned to position Panthers in hull-down positions, exposing only the heavily armoured turret while keeping the more vulnerable hull hidden behind terrain. German defensive doctrine emphasized first-shot capability, with Panthers waiting in carefully prepared positions, allowing Sherman columns to approach unsuspecting before opening fire from ranges where American return fire, even with HVAP, was ineffective due to target presentation and engagement geometry. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe and measurable in ways that went beyond casualty statistics. Crews nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson lighter, claiming it lit on fire every time, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan. While post-war analysis showed this reputation was exaggerated and that Sherman fire vulnerability was comparable to other tanks when properly analyzed, the perception shaped crew behavior in combat. Tank commanders who spotted Panthers often chose to call for artillery support or airstrikes rather than engage directly, ceding tactical initiative to an enemy who could be defeated with the right ammunition and tactics if only crews believed they had a fighting chance. The arrival of HVAP rounds began changing this tactical calculus, but slowly, hampered by the critical scarcity of the ammunition and the lack of comprehensive training on its capabilities and limitations. Many crews received HVAP rounds with minimal instruction beyond use these against Panthers, and had to learn effective employment through combat experience. The first widespread combat test of HVAP ammunition came not in Normandy's claustrophobic hedgerows, but in the open rolling country of Lorraine, where American armoured divisions had broken out from the bocage into terrain that paradoxically favoured German defensive tactics, despite offering better visibility and manoeuvre space. September 1944 found Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army, deep in France, racing toward the German border, with logistics stretched to the breaking point by the rapid advance. Fuel shortages threatened to halt the offensive entirely. Ammunition stocks were critically low, yet Patton's armour continued pushing east, seeking to maintain momentum before German forces could establish coherent defensive lines. The 4th Armoured Division, one of the most effective American armoured formations in Europe, had advanced aggressively through Lorraine, seizing a bridgehead over the Moselle River near Arracourt. German High Command recognized the strategic threat immediately. If Patton's armour reached the Rhine and crossed into Germany proper, the industrial heart of the Reich, the Ruhr and Saar regions that sustained the German war machine, would be exposed to direct Allied attack. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army received orders directly from Hitler to counterattack, destroy the American bridgehead, and push back Patton's advance before it could threaten German territory. The German force assembled for this counterattack included 2 newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped primarily with Panther tanks fresh from German factories, crewed by soldiers with minimal training but protected by what German planners believed was invincible armour. On paper, examining only the technical specifications and unit strength, the German advantage appeared overwhelming, and should have resulted in an American defeat. The two brigades together fielded approximately 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, which possessed roughly 50 Sherman tanks. The numerical advantage favoured Germany. The technical advantage seemed even more decisive. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns in both battalions combined, including 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer IVs. German planners, examining the force ratios and technical specifications, anticipated a rapid victory. The Panthers' technical superiority should compensate for any American advantages in logistics or air support, or so the planning documents assumed. They were, fundamentally, catastrophically mistaken in ways that would become clear within hours of the first engagement. The Battle of Arracourt, fought over 11 days from September 18th to 29th, 1944, would become the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. More importantly, it would demonstrate conclusively that American tank crews, properly trained, adequately supplied, and equipped with specialized ammunition like HVAP, could defeat technically superior German armor through superior tactics, combined arms coordination, and the judicious use of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition that German intelligence had failed to detect. The morning of September 19th began with thick fog blanketing the rolling terrain around Arracourt, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters in some areas. German reconnaissance, already inadequate due to fuel shortages that kept aircraft grounded and limited, patrol operations, was rendered completely blind. The Panzer brigades, lacking proper scouting units after their hasty formation and deployment, advanced blindly into terrain held by American forces, who knew the ground intimately and had established defensive positions during the previous 48 hours. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outposts east and south of Arracourt. The German tanks, factory-new Panthers with inexperienced crews who had received perhaps 6 weeks of training before deployment, moved forward in column formation along roads. This represented a fundamental tactical error that veteran American tankers, men who had fought across France and learned their trade through hard experience, immediately recognized and exploited. Captain Kenneth R. Lameson's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, held positions along key approaches to Arracourt. His Sherman crews, a mixture of 75mm and 76mm gun tanks, had been carefully briefed on the HVAP rounds in their ammunition racks. 6 rounds per 76mm tank. The briefing had been explicit and emphatic. Use them wisely, against Panther turrets or mantlets, at ranges where velocity remained sufficient for penetration. The fog that hindered German reconnaissance now worked decisively in favor of American defenders who had prepared positions and knew exactly where German armor would have to advance to reach Arracourt. A section of Lameson's Shermans occupied positions south of the village, hull down behind a low rise that concealed their hulls while allowing turret observation, when the first Panther materialized from the mist like a steel ghost, barely 75 meters away. At this range, the Panther's superior long-range gunnery advantage meant absolutely nothing. The German crew, peering through optics designed for 1,000-meter engagements, hadn't even identified the American positions when the American gunner fired instantly, instinctively, without waiting for orders. The HVAP round, travelling at over 1,000 meters per second, struck the Panther's gun mantlet with devastating effect. The tungsten carbide-core, maintaining its integrity due to the high impact velocity at close range, punched through the curved cast steel mantlet that German crews had been assured would protect them. The penetrator continued into the fighting compartment, striking the ammunition stored directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther exploded, not from the HVAP round itself, but from its own ammunition detonating in a catastrophic secondary explosion. The turret lifted slightly from the hull, flames and smoke erupting from every opening. 2 more Panthers emerged from the fog in quick succession, following their leader in column formation because the inexperienced crews lacked the tactical awareness to spread out. Both were destroyed within seconds. By other Shermans in Lameson's position, their crews having no time to effectively return fire in the limited visibility, no opportunity to use their superior armor and guns, because American gunners fired first from prepared positions at ranges where HVAP was devastatingly effective. The remaining German tanks in the column, perhaps 4 or 5 Panthers, turned away in confusion, their commanders shocked by the sudden loss of 3 Panthers to what they had been explicitly told were inferior American tanks, incapable of frontal penetration. The crews retreated into the fog, carrying with them the first seeds of doubt about their invulnerability. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar engagements erupted across the Arracourt sector, like lethal surprises emerging from the fog. American tanks, using the limited visibility as concealment rather than obstacle, engaged Panthers at ranges where HVAP rounds were most effective. The German tactical deployment, advancing in columns without proper reconnaissance, proved disastrous in ways that technical superiority could not compensate for. Panther crews repeatedly exposed their thinner side armor, just 40 mm thick and vulnerable even to standard 75 mm rounds, to American flanking fire as they attempted to maneuver in the confusing terrain. Near Arracourt's command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also equipped with 76 mm guns and precious HVAP ammunition, engaged German armor at close range. The fast-moving tank destroyers, capable of 55 miles per hour on roads, proved devastatingly effective in the close range, fog-shrouded combat where speed and positioning mattered more than armor thickness. By noon, as the fog finally lifted and revealed the battlefield carnage, American forward artillery observers could coordinate fire with defending tank companies. The clear skies brought P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 405th Fighter Group overhead, diving through gaps in the clouds to strike German armor with rockets and machine guns, turning Panthers into burning wrecks before their crews could deploy smoke or find concealment. The combination of American advantages became devastatingly clear to German commanders receiving increasingly desperate radio reports. While the Panther possessed superior armor and firepower as an individual weapon system when examined in isolation, American forces employed combined arms tactics as standard doctrine, integrating all available assets into a coherent system that overwhelmed German technical advantages through superior coordination. German tanks advanced without adequate artillery support, the guns having fallen behind during the rapid approach march. They had no air cover, the Luftwaffe being effectively absent from Lorraine skies by September 1944. They advanced without infantry support to clear American defensive positions or provide security against flanking attacks. American forces, by contrast, coordinated armor with artillery fire, air power strikes, infantry defensive positions, and tank destroyer ambushes in an integrated system that made technical specifications of individual weapons almost irrelevant. When Panthers encountered these prepared combined arms defenses, they were destroyed piecemeal despite their superior individual capabilities, because warfare is not conducted according to technical specifications alone. Tanks are destroyed by crews who exploit vulnerabilities under actual combat conditions, not by specifications written in ordnance manuals. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Panther's gun mantlet, necessary to allow the 75 mm gun to elevate and traverse, created a structural weak point that HVAP-equipped Shermans could now engage successfully. The junction between turret and hull, where armor was thinner to allow rotation, represented another target. The side armor, just 40 mm thick, could be penetrated by even standard Sherman guns. The engine deck, protected by only thin plate, was vulnerable to plunging artillery fire. All represented targets that HVAP-equipped Shermans could now engage successfully at combat ranges that previously had been suicidal to attempt. More devastating to German morale than the physical destruction was the psychological impact of discovering their armor was no longer invulnerable, that the fundamental assumption underlying their tactical doctrine had been invalidated. Panther crews had been trained explicitly to believe their tanks could not be penetrated frontally by American fire at combat ranges. Intelligence briefings, training manuals, and veteran crews all emphasized the same doctrine: keep the front toward the enemy and you are safe. The first Panther commanders to watch Sherman rounds punch through their mantlets and detonate ready ammunition, those who survived such encounters, learned otherwise in the most traumatic way possible. Survivors of these engagements carried that knowledge back to their units when they retreated, spreading awareness through the German armor formations that American tanks now possessed ammunition capable of defeating Panthers under favorable circumstances. By the afternoon of September 19th, German tank commanders were reporting frantically to headquarters that American Shermans possessed new, far more powerful ammunition than intelligence had predicted. The reports were confused and often contradictory, as happens in combat when crews struggle to understand what killed their comrades. Some claimed the Americans had secretly deployed tank destroyers with 90mm guns among regular Sherman formations. Others suggested the British had provided 17-pounder Firefly tanks to American units without informing German intelligence. The truth, that American industry had developed specialized tungsten core ammunition that partially negated the Panther's armor advantage through metallurgical innovation, was more troubling to German planners than any of these incorrect theories. It meant that American industrial capacity could respond to tactical problems faster than German industry could counter them, could solve battlefield challenges through engineering and production, while German forces remained static in their capabilities. The fighting continued through September 22nd, when the major German offensive efforts finally stalled completely, the attacking brigades having lost cohesion and offensive capability. American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns, according to careful post-battle accounting. American losses stood at 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers, a significant number representing real American casualties, but a take-and-kill ratio that heavily favored the Americans despite their technical disadvantage in individual tank performance. The Battle of Arracourt represented not just a tactical victory measured in destroyed vehicles, but a psychological watershed that would influence subsequent armored operations across the Western Front. American tank crews learned through direct experience that they could defeat Panthers without waiting for specialized tank destroyers or overwhelming air support to arrive. They learned that HVAP ammunition, combined with proper tactics and favorable engagement conditions, gave them a fighting chance. German crews, conversely, lost the psychological security of believing in absolute frontal invulnerability, the confidence that had sustained them through previous engagements against overwhelming American numerical superiority. The armor that had protected them could be penetrated. The Americans had found a solution. The German perspective on Arracourt, gathered from after-action reports and prisoner interrogations, was one of confusion and bitter recrimination about tactical decisions. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered battle on September 18th with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns, could muster fewer than 20 operational vehicles by September 29th. The losses were staggering, the defeat comprehensive. German after-action reports struggled to explain the catastrophic defeat. The technical superiority of the Panther remained undeniable on paper, the specifications clearly superior to the Sherman. How had inexperienced crews in newly produced tanks been defeated so comprehensively by American forces that intelligence had assured them were technically inferior? The answers lay partly in training and combat experience differentials. The Panzer Brigade crews had minimal training, often arriving at the front with only weeks of instruction on their vehicles, barely enough time to learn basic operations, much less develop the tactical judgment required for effective combat employment. American tank crews in the 4th Armoured Division were veterans who had fought across France since the breakout from Normandy. Men who understood combined arms warfare intuitively, who had learned to read terrain for tactical advantage, who coordinated instinctively with supporting infantry and artillery. But training alone did not fully explain Panther losses, particularly the frontal penetrations that should not have been possible with standard American ammunition, according to German understanding of ballistic performance. German intelligence officers examining destroyed Panthers in detail found entry holes smaller than expected from standard 76mm ammunition, suggesting a sub-caliber projectile of some kind. Examination of unexploded rounds recovered near disabled tanks rounds that had penetrated earth berms or struck glancing blows without detonating, revealed the truth that German ordnance experts had feared. The Americans had deployed tungsten core ammunition, a technological development that German intelligence had completely failed to detect, despite its implications for armored warfare. This discovery had profound strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation at Arracourt. Germany itself had developed similar ammunition, the Panzer Granate 40, which used tungsten cores to improve penetration against Soviet heavy tanks. German ordnance engineers understood the technology intimately, having pioneered much of the underlying research. But German tungsten supplies were critically limited by late 1944, with domestic production minimal and Swedish imports declining, as neutral Sweden increasingly restricted exports to Germany. German tungsten production was focused on machine tools rather than ammunition, tools needed to manufacture the aircraft engines that represented Germany's last hope for maintaining fighter production against overwhelming Allied strategic bombing. If Americans could field specialized tungsten core ammunition in quantities sufficient to distribute to frontline tank units engaged in routine combat operations, it demonstrated industrial capacity and resource access that Germany could not match even theoretically. Not only were American tanks more numerous, better supported logistically, and backed by overwhelming air superiority, but they were now equipped with ammunition that partially negated Germany's carefully engineered technical advantages in armor protection. The impact of HVAP ammunition extended beyond the immediate tactical results at Arracourt into the broader psychological sphere that shapes military effectiveness. As word spread through American armored units that the new ammunition could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances, that Shermans weren't helpless against German armor, tank crews became measurably more willing to engage German armor directly rather than calling for support. The psychological paralysis that had affected some units during the difficult Normandy fighting, when crews felt genuinely helpless against Panthers, began to dissipate as confidence grew. Crews still respected the Panthers' capabilities, maintained appropriate tactical caution, but no longer felt helpless or outmatched in every engagement. They had a weapon that gave them a chance. This shift in morale proved crucial for subsequent operations through the fall and winter. A crew that believes it can fight effectively will engage aggressively, seeking advantageous positions and taking calculated risks when opportunities appear. A crew that believes it is fundamentally outmatched will hesitate, avoiding combat when possible, ceding initiative to the enemy. HVAP ammunition, though in critically short supply throughout the war, provided American tankers with a weapon that allowed them to fight Panthers on more equal terms when tactical conditions were favorable. Even crews that had never personally fired an HVAP round, units that had received only a handful of specialized rounds or none at all, benefited psychologically from knowing the ammunition existed somewhere in the supply system, that it might be available when most desperately needed. The knowledge that American industry had responded to the Panther challenge restored confidence that had been badly shaken in Normandy. Commanders at every level were forced to make difficult prioritization decisions, with the desperately limited HVAP supply that never matched tactical demand. Tank destroyers, whose specific mission focused on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation in most units. Sherman tanks, with their dual role of supporting infantry assaults and engaging enemy armor, often received fewer rounds, despite encountering enemy tanks more frequently in varied tactical situations. This allocation system, managed at multiple command levels from Army headquarters down through Corps, Division, and Battalion, resulted in inevitable inefficiencies and frustrations. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately use based on their sector's threat assessment, while others in heavy combat exhausted their supply within days and received no resupply despite urgent requests, because logistics networks struggled to match distribution with tactical needs. When German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, catching American forces off guard with an attack through terrain considered unsuitable for major armored operations, American tank units faced renewed intense pressure. The Battle of the Bulge saw hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in winter conditions that favored defensive fighting and severely limited Allied air superiority, due to persistent poor weather that kept fighter bombers grounded. American Sherman crews relied heavily on their scarce HVAP ammunition to engage German heavy armor in the close-range fighting that characterized the Ardennes battles. The shortage became critical within days of heavy fighting. Some units exhausted their entire HVAP supply completely within the first week and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as logistical networks struggled desperately to deliver ammunition through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances that had cut normal supply routes. Yet even in the difficult fighting of the Ardennes, fighting that initially favored German forces and created a genuine crisis for American commanders, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate substantially for technical disadvantage. Tank crews coordinated closely with infantry, using bazooka teams to disable Panthers from close range, while Shermans provided covering fire and suppressed German infantry. Artillery forward observers called in time on target missions that damaged optics, disabled tracks, and killed exposed crew members, even when shells could not penetrate armor directly. Air support, when weather finally permitted operations in late December and January, proved devastatingly effective against German armor concentrated on approach roads, unable to disperse due to fuel shortages that kept vehicles road-bound. The Battle of the Bulge ended with German armored forces shattered, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an offensive that failed completely to reach its strategic objectives. By early 1945, the strategic picture had shifted decisively and irreversibly in Allied favor. American and British forces were preparing to cross the Rhine into Germany proper. Soviet armies were advancing from the east, having shattered German defensive lines in massive winter offensives that destroyed entire German army groups. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under combined strategic bombing, loss of territory containing critical resources and manufacturing facilities, and severe shortages of raw materials, including fuel, rubber, and tungsten. Panther production, which had reached 3,900 units in 1944, representing a significant industrial achievement, fell sharply in early 1945 as factories were bombed repeatedly, transportation networks were disrupted by air attack, and raw materials became unavailable. Even when Panthers were produced and delivered to units, fuel shortages often kept them immobile, static pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. German tank units in the final months frequently abandoned tanks, not because of combat damage, but because they had no fuel to operate them or transport to evacuate them during retreats. The technical limitations of HVAP, while less publicized than its successes in engagements like Arracourt, deserve examination for historical completeness and understanding. The tungsten carbide-core, while excellent as penetrating armor when impact conditions were favorable, was inherently brittle due to its extreme hardness. Below certain impact velocities, approximately 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the core could shatter on contact rather than penetrate, wasting the round and potentially alerting the target. This meant that HVAP effectiveness declined significantly at longer ranges, where velocity had decreased substantially from muzzle velocity. The effective range against Panther mantlets was approximately 1,000 meters under ideal conditions. Beyond this distance, the probability of the core shattering on impact increased substantially, making the specialized ammunition no more effective than standard rounds and wasting scarce tungsten resources. American tankers learned these limitations through combat experience, sometimes tragically when rounds fired beyond effective range failed to penetrate and provoked devastating return fire from German guns that remained effective at much longer ranges. Training on proper HVAP employment was often minimal or non-existent as the ammunition arrived at frontline units faster than training materials could be developed and distributed. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under actual combat conditions, a brutal form of education. The post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition revealed both its significant successes and notable limitations in balanced assessment. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP was highly effective when hits were achieved, reliably penetrating and often causing catastrophic secondary explosions, as rounds detonated ammunition stored near the breach. Against the glacis plate, even with HVAP, results remained poor, except at very close ranges and extremely favourable angles. The extreme slope meant that tungsten-core rounds travelling at high velocity often ricocheted or shattered on impact without achieving penetration. This meant Sherman crews still needed to manoeuvre for advantageous shot angles, flanking Panthers when tactically possible, exactly as they had before HVAP became available. The ammunition did not make Sherman tanks technical equals to Panthers in specifications that could be measured in laboratories, but it gave American crews a fighting chance in engagements where previously they had little realistic hope of frontal penetration, and that psychological shift proved as important as the ballistic improvement. The transformation of American tank crews from mid-1944 to early 1945 reflected the cumulative impact of combat experience, improved equipment availability, including HVAP ammunition, and growing familiarity with German tactics and weaknesses. Crews that landed in Normandy in June 1944 often felt genuinely apprehensive about facing German armour, particularly Panthers and Tigers whose reputations preceded them. By early 1945, after months of sustained combat, significant training improvements, increased availability of 76mm Shermans, and growing familiarity with HVAP ammunition capabilities and limitations, American tankers approached engagements far more confidently. This psychological shift had direct tactical consequences, measurable in engagement outcomes. Confident crews fought more aggressively, took calculated risks when opportunities appeared, and exploited tactical advantages decisively. While HVAP ammunition alone did not create this transformation, its availability and proven effectiveness contributed meaningfully to improved American armored force morale and tactical performance in the war's final months. The legacy of HVAP development continues influencing modern ammunition design in direct lineage. American armor doctrine from 1945 onward consistently emphasized ammunition effectiveness as a critical component of overall tank system design, not an afterthought. Modern tank ammunition uses depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators, materials chosen for essentially the same density and hardness properties that made tungsten carbide effective in World War II, just refined through decades of additional research. The underlying physical principle remains constant from 1944 to present day. Concentrate maximum kinetic energy into the smallest possible, extremely dense projectile moving at the highest achievable velocity. The continuity from 1944 HVAP to present-day armor-piercing fin-stabilized, discarding sabot ammunition illustrates how foundational lessons from World War II continue directly influencing military technology 8 decades later. September 19, 1944. When American Sherman crews first engaged Panthers with HVAP ammunition at Arracourt, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible marked a genuine turning point in the psychological balance of armored warfare on the Western Front. German crews who had fought confidently behind their superior armor learned that American tanks could pose a serious frontal threat under favorable conditions. American crews who had felt genuinely outmatched gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed ammunition that could defeat Panthers when properly employed. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten core ammunition produced in American factories and delivered to frontline units despite severe supply constraints, influenced every subsequent armored engagement of the European war. HVAP ammunition, though never available in the quantities commanders desired, provided enough improved capability to transform American tank crews from uncertain defenders into confident attackers willing to engage German armor directly, rather than waiting for specialized support. The crews who fired those first HVAP rounds in combat, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible just months earlier, demonstrated that industrial capacity and material science applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. This fundamental lesson, learned at considerable cost on battlefields across France and Germany, remains directly relevant for military planners facing the technological challenges of modern warfare, where technical superiority alone never guarantees victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.